They were 73 and 76, broke, betrayed by their own children, and told they were too old to matter anymore. But when Margaret and Frank opened the frozen cellar beneath that abandoned Alaskan cabin, what they found wasn't just $265 million in hidden geological treasures. It was proof that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest advantage of all. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The fluorescent lights in the conference room hummed like dying wasps as Margaret Hayes sat across from her 3 children, their expensive suits and cold expressions making the air feel thick and suffocating. She was 73 years old, her hands weathered from 47 years of running Hayes Hardware with her husband Frank, and she had never felt smaller in her life. Frank sat beside her, 76 and silent, his calloused fingers gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles had gone white. Their eldest son David leaned forward, his voice dripping with practiced concern that barely masked his impatience. "Mom, Dad, you have to see reason. You're not getting any younger, and the business needs fresh leadership. The offer from Sutton Industries is generous, $200,000 for everything." Margaret felt her stomach turn. Hayes Hardware wasn't just a business. It was the shop where she had taught all 3 of her children to count change, to treat customers with respect, to understand the value of honest work. It was the place where Frank had spent every morning for nearly 5 decades, unlocking the doors before sunrise, knowing every regular by name. $200,000 for a business they had built from nothing, for a property in downtown Portland that was worth triple that amount for their entire life's work. "David," she began, her voice shaking slightly, "your father and I aren't ready to—" "That's exactly the problem," interrupted Jessica, their daughter, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her tablet screen. "You're not ready, you're never ready, but the market doesn't wait for people to be ready. And frankly, neither can we. Dad forgot to order the spring inventory again last month. Mrs. Patterson had to call me directly because you didn't have the garden supplies she needed." That wasn't true. Margaret knew it wasn't true. They had had a supplier delay, nothing more. But the way Jessica said it, with such casual certainty, made Margaret doubt her own memory for a moment. "We're doing this because we love you," David added, his tone suggesting the matter was already settled. "Someone has to make the hard decisions. Someone has to be the adult here, the adult." As if Margaret and Frank, who had raised 3 children, built a successful business from scratch, survived recessions and competition and every challenge life threw at them, were somehow children now. As if turning 70 meant surrendering the right to their own lives. Frank finally spoke, his voice rough as gravel. "We don't need anyone to make decisions for us. We built this business. We know what we're doing." Thomas, their youngest son, shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing. He just nodded along with his siblings, like he had done his whole life, never quite brave enough to stand apart from David and Jessica. "Dad, you're almost 80, Jessica said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone usually reserved for small children. "Last week you left the register open overnight. Anyone could have walked in and cleaned you out." Frank's jaw tightened. He had forgotten to lock the register exactly once in 47 years, after working a 14-hour day when their part-time employee called in sick. But Jessica made it sound like he was losing his mind, like every small human mistake was proof of incompetence. David slid a thick stack of documents across the table. "We've already drawn up the paperwork. Everything's ready. All you need to do is sign. We've even found you a nice assisted living facility in Beaverton. 24-hour care, activities, meals prepared, everything you could need." "We don't need assisted living," Margaret said, her voice firmer now, anger beginning to break through the hurt. "We need our home, our business, our independence." Jessica sighed dramatically, looking at her brothers with an expression that said, "See, this is what we're dealing with. Mom, be realistic. You can barely manage the inventory anymore. The bookkeeping is a mess. You're running the business into the ground, and when it finally collapses, there won't be anything left. We're trying to save you from yourselves." The meeting lasted another 2 hours. 2 hours of relentless pressure, of their children tag-teaming arguments, of legal documents and financial projections and carefully crafted narratives about decline and necessity and love. 2 hours of Margaret and Frank being made to feel like burdens, like problems that needed to be solved rather than people who deserved respect. In the end, they signed, not because they wanted to, not because they agreed, but because their children had orchestrated everything so carefully that resistance felt impossible. The lawyers were hired, the buyers were waiting, the moving company was already scheduled, and their 3 children stood there with expressions that mixed pity with barely concealed eagerness to access their inheritance early. Within 6 weeks, Hayes Hardware was gone. The building sold to Sutton Industries, who immediately gutted it to make room for a generic big-box satellite store. The inventory liquidated at pennies on the dollar. The regular customers who had shopped there for decades left confused and hurt, wondering why the Hayes family had abandoned them. Frank and Margaret found themselves in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Portland, the kind of place with thin walls and a parking lot full of broken cars and graffiti. The $200,000 had somehow shrunk to $73,000 after legal fees, moving costs, real estate agent commissions, and various expenses their children had assured them were necessary. David rarely called anymore. When he did, it was brief and perfunctory, checking boxes on some mental list of minimal filial duty. Jessica was always too busy to visit, her life consumed by her marketing career and her children's endless activities. Thomas sent occasional text messages that felt copied and pasted, generic updates that could have been sent to anyone. The grandchildren they had hoped to spend more time with were always at soccer practice or piano lessons or birthday parties. Margaret and Frank somehow were never invited to anymore. The family dinners they had once hosted every Sunday had stopped completely. Their children had gotten what they wanted: the business sold, the asset liquidated, the old folks tucked away where they wouldn't be inconvenient. And now there was no reason to maintain the pretense of closeness. Margaret spent her days staring out the window at the chain-link fence that bordered their new home, watching trash blow across the cracked asphalt, wondering how everything had fallen apart so quickly. The apartment was dim even at midday, the windows facing north where the sun never quite reached. The neighbors were loud, arguing through the walls at all hours. The heating barely worked. The locks on the doors felt flimsy and inadequate. Frank barely spoke anymore. He would sit in his old recliner, the only piece of furniture they had kept from their previous house, and stare at the wall as if trying to see through it to a past that felt increasingly like a dream. Sometimes Margaret would catch him looking at his hands, those weathered, capable hands that had built displays and repaired tools and shaken hands with thousands of customers over the years, now hanging useless at his sides with nothing to do. They had built something that mattered. They had created jobs and served their community and raised 3 children who they thought understood the value of honest work. And in less than 2 months, all of it had been stripped away, sold off, reduced to a number in a bank account that felt more like blood money than security. Margaret tried to stay positive. She suggested they volunteer somewhere, maybe find part-time work, reconnect with old friends. But Frank had retreated into himself, and she could feel her own spirit dimming day by day. At 73, she felt ancient in a way she never had before. Not physically old, but old in the sense of being obsolete, unnecessary, pushed aside by a world that had decided her time was over. It was on a Tuesday morning in late September, gray and drizzling in that persistent Portland way, when the letter arrived. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, with an Alaskan postmark and the return address of a law firm in Fairbanks. Margaret almost threw it away, assuming it was some kind of scam. She had been getting a lot of those lately, predatory lenders and reverse mortgage offers and all the vultures who circled elderly people with limited resources. But something made her open it. Maybe curiosity. Maybe desperation for anything that broke the monotony of her new life. Maybe just the fact that she had nothing else to do that morning except stare at the walls and wonder how many more years of this emptiness she would have to endure. Inside was a letter from a law firm called Finch & Associates, written on expensive letterhead, informing them that a distant relative named Samuel Whitmore had passed away at the age of 91. The name rang a faint bell in Margaret's memory. Samuel had been Frank's mother's cousin, a quiet man with weathered hands and kind eyes, who they had met exactly twice at family reunions back in the 1970s and 80s. She remembered him telling stories about Alaska that made it sound like another world entirely. He had moved there in the early 1960s to work as a surveyor and had never come back to the lower 48. The family had largely forgotten about him, another distant relative who sent Christmas cards sporadically and otherwise existed only as a faded memory. According to the letter, Samuel had left them property. A log cabin on 40 acres of land near the Yukon River, approximately 180 miles northwest of Fairbanks. The lawyer, a man named Robert Finch, explained that Samuel had very few living relatives and had specifically requested that the property go to Frank and Margaret if they were still alive. There are no liens or debts associated with the property, the letter read. However, I must inform you that the cabin is quite remote and has been unoccupied for several years since Mr. Whitmore moved to assisted living in Fairbanks. The winters are harsh, access is difficult, and the property requires maintenance. If you choose to accept this inheritance, please contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange transfer of the deed and property keys. Margaret read the letter 3 times, her heart beating faster with each reading. Property, land, a cabin. It was probably nothing, some falling down shack in the middle of nowhere. But it was something. Something that was theirs, that their children hadn't taken, that represented possibility instead of loss. She showed the letter to Frank. He read it slowly, his lips moving slightly as he processed each word, a habit he had developed in recent months that worried Margaret because he had always been such a quick reader. "Alaska," he finally said, his voice rough from disuse. "It's probably nothing," Margaret replied, even as something in her chest flickered to life, something that felt dangerously close to hope. A broken-down cabin in the middle of nowhere. Samuel was 91. How well could he have maintained it? But she was already thinking about the name Samuel Whitmore, trying to remember more about him. She recalled a tall, lean man with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see things others missed. He had shown them photographs once, at a reunion in Seattle, pictures of vast landscapes and endless sky and a cabin that looked small against the immensity of the Alaskan wilderness. He talked about the land like it was sacred, Frank said suddenly, the first unprompted words he had spoken in days. "Remember? At that reunion in '83, he said Alaska changed him, made him understand what mattered." Margaret did remember now. Samuel had been different from the rest of the family. Quieter, more thoughtful, less interested in the usual gossip and small talk. He had talked about the midnight sun and the northern lights and the profound silence that made you feel both small and infinite at the same time. That night, Margaret called David to tell him about the letter. She could hear the dismissive smile in his voice before he even spoke. "Mom, come on. It's obviously worthless. Some shack in the wilderness that will cost more to maintain than it's worth. The property taxes alone will eat through what little money you have left. Just sign it over to the state or whatever and forget about it. Don't waste your energy on this." "We might go look at it," Margaret said, surprising herself with the words. David laughed. "You're going to fly to Alaska. Mom, you're 73 years old. Dad's 76. You'll freeze to death in some cabin in the woods before you even figure out where the bathroom is. This is insane." "We're not dead yet, David." I didn't say you were dead. I said you're not equipped for this. Be realistic. Sell the property sight unseen to some developer or logger or whoever wants frozen wasteland. Take whatever money you can get and stay in Portland where there are hospitals and grocery stores and civilization. Margaret hung up without saying goodbye. She called Jessica next. The response was even worse. Absolutely not, Jessica said firmly. I forbid it. If you two go traipsing off to Alaska at your age, you're going to end up dead or injured, and then we'll have to deal with it. We'll have to fly up there and identify bodies or arrange medical evacuations or God knows what. No, sell the property, stay put, stop making everything more difficult than it needs to be. Forbid. As if Margaret needed permission from her daughter to make her own decisions. Thomas was only slightly more sympathetic. I mean, I get it, he said hesitantly. It sounds like an adventure, but Mom, be realistic. You and Dad aren't in any shape to handle something like that. Alaska is harsh. What if something happens? What if Dad has a heart attack in the middle of nowhere? What if you break a hip and there's no hospital for 100 miles? What if we're fine? Margaret countered. What if this is exactly what we need? But Thomas couldn't answer that. He just repeated that it was too risky, too crazy, too much for people their age. Over the next week, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about the letter. She researched the property online, finding it marked on satellite maps as a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. She read about the region, about the Yukon River and the wildlife and the communities of people who had chosen to live in one of the most remote and challenging environments on Earth. She thought about their apartment with its thin walls and broken heater and the constant noise of neighbors fighting. She thought about the $73,000 that seemed like a lot until you divided it by the years they probably had remaining. She thought about her children, who had taken everything and given back nothing but a cramped space and irregular phone calls. And she thought about Samuel Whitmore, that quiet man who had chosen Alaska over comfort, who had lived there for over 50 years, who had specifically left this property to them. He could have left it to anyone, Margaret said to Frank one evening. Any of the relatives. But he chose us. Why? Frank looked at her, and for the first time in months, she saw something besides resignation in his eyes. Maybe he saw something in us that we've forgotten. 2 days later, Margaret called Robert Finch in Fairbanks and told him they were coming to Alaska. They used some of their remaining money to buy plane tickets, warm clothes from a thrift store, and travel insurance that cost more than seemed reasonable but that provided some small comfort. Their children were furious. David sent angry texts calling them irresponsible. Jessica left voicemails threatening to pursue legal action to prevent them from endangering themselves. Thomas just sounded sad and worried, which somehow hurt worse than the anger. But Margaret and Frank had made their decision. They packed light, just clothes and a few essentials, and left most of their belongings in the depressing apartment. On a cold October morning, they took a taxi to the Portland airport, checked their bags, and boarded a plane to Seattle, then another to Anchorage, then finally a smaller plane to Fairbanks. The journey took most of the day. They had a 3-hour layover in Seattle where Frank bought Margaret a terrible airport coffee that somehow tasted like hope. She watched him shuffle to the gate, his gait slower than it used to be but still determined, still Frank. When had their children stopped seeing their father as a person and started seeing him as a problem to be managed? The flight from Anchorage to Fairbanks was turbulent, the small plane bouncing through clouds and wind. Margaret gripped Frank's hand and he squeezed back, and in that moment they weren't scared. They were alive in a way they hadn't been since signing away their hardware store. When they finally landed in Fairbanks, the air was shockingly cold and clean in a way that city air never was. It was late afternoon, but the sun was already low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Inside the small terminal, a man stood holding a handwritten sign that read, Hayes. Robert Finch was younger than Margaret expected, maybe 40. with the kind of practical outdoor gear that suggested he actually used it rather than just wearing it for fashion. His handshake was firm, and his smile reached his eyes. "I have to be honest," he said as he drove them through Fairbanks in his battered pickup truck. "When Samuel told me about you both, I wasn't sure you'd actually come. Most people hear remote Alaskan cabin and decide to just sell sight unseen." "Our children suggested the same thing," Frank said dryly. Robert laughed, a genuine sound that echoed in the truck. "I bet they did, but Samuel was very specific. He wanted people who would appreciate it, not just liquidate it for quick cash. He said something about you both understanding what it meant to build something with your own hands." Margaret felt tears pricking at her eyes. Samuel had remembered them, had thought about them enough to leave them this gift. They drove for over 3 hours on increasingly rough roads, the landscape transforming from civilization to wilderness in a way that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Margaret watched spruce forests roll past, dense and dark and ancient. She saw the Yukon River in the distance, glinting in the fading light like hammered silver. She felt her breath catch at the sheer scope of the land, at the emptiness that wasn't empty at all but full of life and possibility. Finally, Robert turned onto a barely visible dirt road. The truck bounced and groaned over roots and rocks for another 20 minutes, branches scraping against the sides, before a cabin came into view. It sat in a clearing surrounded by tall spruce and birch trees, their leaves mostly fallen now, leaving skeletal branches against the darkening sky. The cabin was larger than Margaret expected, built from thick logs that had weathered to a deep gray, with a steep roof designed to shed heavy snow. A sagging porch wrapped around 2 sides, and small windows reflected the last light of day like tired eyes. "Here we are," Robert said, parking the truck. "Welcome to your inheritance." Margaret and Frank climbed out slowly, their joints stiff from the long journey. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant call of a raven. The cold bit at Margaret's face, but it was a clean cold, sharp and honest, nothing like the damp chill of Portland. She looked at the cabin, at the dark forest surrounding it, at the vast sky overhead already beginning to show a few early stars. This was theirs. This strange, remote, impossible place was actually theirs. "I know it's not much," Robert began, but Margaret held up her hand. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. Robert handed Frank a heavy iron key attached to a ring with 2 other smaller keys. Samuel kept it maintained until about 5 years ago when his health declined. The roof is solid, the well still works, and there's a generator for power, though you'll want to be conservative with it. The nearest town is about 40 miles south on the highway, and cell service is pretty much non-existent out here." He paused, then added, "There's one more thing Samuel wanted me to tell you. He said the property has stories to tell, but only to people who know how to listen." I never quite understood what he meant, but he made me promise to pass that along. After Robert left, promising to check on them in a few days, Margaret and Frank stood together on the porch. The temperature was dropping quickly as darkness fell, and Margaret could see her breath forming clouds in the air. Frank fitted the main key into the lock. It turned smoothly as if the cabin had been waiting for them. The door swung open with a creak that echoed through the clearing. Frank reached inside and found a switch. Light flickered on, powered by the generator that apparently still worked. The interior smelled of old wood and dust and something else, something that reminded Margaret of museums and carefully preserved memories. One large room served as kitchen and living area, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall. 2 smaller bedrooms branched off the back, and a narrow staircase led to a loft space under the peaked roof. The furniture was simple but well made. A pine table scarred with age and use, sturdy chairs that looked handcrafted, a sofa that had seen better decades but still looked comfortable. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books about geology, Alaska history, surveying techniques, and wildlife identification. Margaret ran her hand along the table, leaving trails in the dust. "He lived here for over 50 years." Frank was examining a framed map on the wall, yellowed with age, showing topographical lines and handwritten notations. "This isn't just a cabin. It's a workspace. Look at all these books, these maps." Samuel was doing something out here. They spent the next hour exploring, finding surprises in every corner. A closet full of cold-weather gear that looked like it would fit them both. A pantry stocked with canned goods that wouldn't expire for years. A beautiful hand-carved chess set on a side table, pieces waiting mid-game as if Samuel had just stepped away for a moment. As darkness fell completely and they figured out how to start the generator properly, Margaret made simple soup from the canned supplies while Frank got the fireplace going. They ate in comfortable silence, too tired for conversation, but something had shifted between them. They weren't just two old people who had been pushed aside. They were pioneers, adventurers, people starting something new even at an age when society said they should be winding down. That night, Margaret woke to use the bathroom and found Frank standing at the window, staring out at the moonlit forest. She joined him, slipping her hand into his. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the clearing and making the frost on the ground sparkle like diamonds. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That maybe this isn't a coincidence," he said softly. "Samuel could have left this place to anyone, any of the family. But he chose us specifically. Or we were just the only ones he remembered." Frank shook his head. "No, Robert said Samuel was specific. He wanted people who would appreciate it, who understood what it meant to build something. He chose us on purpose." He turned to look at her, and in the moonlight she could see something in his face she hadn't seen in months. Purpose, determination, life. "What if there's more to this place than just a cabin?" he said. "What if Samuel left us something that goes deeper than property?" The next morning, they began exploring the land around the cabin. 40 acres in Alaska was substantial, and much of it was untouched wilderness. They found old survey markers hammered into trees, their metal tags marked with numbers and dates. They found a shed behind the cabin, its door padlocked but visible through gaps in the wood, filled with tools and equipment. They found a small creek running clear and cold through the eastern edge of the property, its water so clean Frank cupped his hands and drank directly from it. The forest was dense with spruce and birch, the ground carpeted with moss and fallen needles. They moved slowly, their 70-something bodies not built for hiking through wilderness. But they kept going. There was something about this place, something that called to them. It was late afternoon, the sun already sinking low, when Frank stopped suddenly behind the cabin. Margaret, who had been examining what looked like another survey marker, turned to see him crouched near the foundation stones. "Margaret," he said quietly, "come look at this." She walked over carefully, her boots crunching on frost. Frank was brushing away fallen leaves and needles from something half hidden in the ground. Set into the earth at a slight angle was a wooden door, built flat like a storm cellar entrance. It was partially obscured by overgrown brush that someone had clearly cultivated to camouflage it. The wood was weathered but solid, and when Frank pulled away more vegetation, they could see it was secured with a heavy padlock. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "What is this?" "I don't know," Frank said, examining the lock. "But someone went to a lot of trouble to hide it." He pulled out the key ring Robert had given them. 3 keys hung on it. The main cabin key they had already used. A smaller key they had discovered opened a storage trunk in the loft. And a third key, larger and older than the others, its brass darkened with time and use. Margaret watched as Frank fitted the third key into the padlock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she heard a click, loud in the quiet forest, and the lock popped open. They looked at each other. In Frank's eyes, she saw excitement mixed with apprehension. In the fading afternoon light, with the temperature dropping and the forest growing dark around them, they stood at a threshold between their old life and something completely unknown. "Should we?" Frank asked. Margaret thought about their children, who had dismissed them as incompetent. She thought about the business they had built and lost. She thought about the apartment with its thin walls and the feeling of being invisible, unnecessary, finished. She thought about Samuel Whitmore, that quiet man who had chosen Alaska over comfort and who had left this place to them for reasons they didn't yet understand. "Yes," she said firmly. "Definitely, yes." Together they pulled at the door. It resisted at first, sealed by time and ice and intention, but finally gave way with a groan that seemed to echo through the darkening forest. Cold air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of stone and ice and preservation. Below was darkness and a set of rough-hewn stairs descending into the earth. Margaret could see the first few steps, but beyond that, nothing but shadow. Frank looked at her one more time, a question in his eyes. She nodded. He descended first, his steps careful on the narrow stairs. Margaret followed close behind, pulling out the flashlight they had found in the cabin earlier. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing stone walls and timber supports and stairs that went down much further than seemed possible. 20 feet, 30 feet. The cold intensified with each step, not painful but profound, the kind of cold that preserves things indefinitely. Margaret's breath came in visible clouds, and her heart hammered against her ribs. At the bottom the stairs opened into a chamber. Frank stepped off onto level ground and Margaret joined him, sweeping the flashlight beam across the space. What they saw made them both freeze completely. The cellar was massive, extending in multiple directions like the arms of a cross. The walls and ceiling were supported by thick timbers, and everything was covered in a thin layer of ice crystals that caught their flashlight beam and sparkled like stars. But it wasn't the construction that stole their breath. It was what filled the space. Tables ran the length of the main chamber, and on those tables sat hundreds of carefully labeled boxes and containers, rock samples in clear cases, core samples in long tubes, trays of minerals and stones that gleamed even in the dim light, maps and charts protected in plastic sleeves, their surfaces covered with notations and calculations in precise handwriting. Margaret moved forward on shaking legs. She picked up the nearest container and read the label. Sample 42A. Location 64 degrees north, 151 degrees west. Depth 200 feet. Composition: See analysis log. Inside the container was a rock unlike any she had ever seen. Even in the uncertain light of the flashlight, she could see flecks of gold running through it like veins of light. "Frank," she whispered, "what is all this?" But Frank had moved deeper into the cellar, following the eastern arm of the cross-shaped space. Margaret heard his sharp intake of breath and hurried to join him. This section was different. Here, the samples weren't in simple boxes, but in reinforced cases with thick glass fronts. And inside those cases were stones that caught the light and held it, transforming it into fire and ice and every color imaginable. Gemstones. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Raw and uncut but unmistakable. Sapphires the size of hen's eggs in shades of blue and pink and orange. Emeralds still embedded in matrix rock. And there, in the largest case, a cluster of rough diamonds, their surfaces unpolished but their clarity evident even in this dim light. Margaret's hands trembled as she set down her flashlight on one of the tables, its beam pointing upward and casting strange shadows on the frozen ceiling. She looked at Frank, at the cases of gemstones, at the endless tables of documented samples. "He was a surveyor," she said slowly, her mind trying to process what they were seeing. Samuel worked as a surveyor. Frank had found a binder on a nearby shelf. He opened it with hands that shook, and Margaret moved close to read over his shoulder. Inside were pages of analysis, assay reports, geological surveys, and calculations. Technical language that neither of them fully understood, but numbers that were impossible to misread. Sample values. Estimated deposit sizes. Projected extraction yields. And there, on one page marked in Samuel's careful handwriting, conservative estimate of total formation value, based on confirmed deposits and standard extraction projections, $265 million. $265 million. The number seemed impossible, absurd. The kind of thing that happened in movies, not to two elderly people who had been betrayed by their children and left with almost nothing. Margaret's knees gave out. She sat down hard on the frozen floor of the cellar, the cold seeping through her jeans, her mind spinning. They had come to Alaska expecting a broken-down cabin, maybe a few acres of worthless land, a place to escape the depression of their Portland apartment. Instead, they had found this, a vault full of geological samples, evidence of mineral deposits worth hundreds of millions of dollars. A secret that Samuel Whitmore had kept for decades, preserved in this frozen cellar beneath the Alaskan wilderness, and somehow, impossibly, he had left it all to them. Frank sat down beside her, the binder still open in his lap. For a long moment, they just stared at the cases of gemstones sparkling in the flashlight beam. Then Frank started to laugh, a sound somewhere between joy and hysteria. "Our children," he said, "convinced us to sell our business for $200,000, told us we were too old and incompetent to manage our own lives." Margaret started laughing too, tears running down her face. "And now we're sitting in a cellar in Alaska looking at $265 million worth of minerals." They laughed until they cried, until the cold finally forced them to stand up and climb back out into the evening air. They sealed the cellar door and locked it, their hands still shaking. As they walked back to the cabin under a sky now blazing with the first hints of the northern lights, green and purple ribbons dancing overhead, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Pure, terrifying, overwhelming hope. That night, Margaret barely slept. She lay in the loft bedroom, listening to Frank's breathing beside her and the absolute silence of the Alaskan wilderness pressing against the cabin walls. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those gemstones sparkling in the flashlight beam, saw Samuel's careful handwriting documenting decades of work, saw that impossible number, $265 million. At first light, she and Frank descended into the cellar again, this time prepared. They brought better flashlights, warm clothes, thermoses of hot coffee, and a determination to understand exactly what Samuel had left them. The cellar felt different in the morning light filtering down the stairwell, less mysterious, more like what it truly was, a workspace, a laboratory, a life's work preserved in permafrost. Frank found a switch near the bottom of the stairs, and when he flipped it, LED lights flickered on overhead. Samuel had wired the cellar for electricity, running lines from the generator above. Under the steady illumination, the scope of what they were looking at became even more staggering. The main chamber stretched at least 40 feet in length, with 3 smaller arms branching off in different directions. Every surface was organized with meticulous precision, labels on everything, systems for categorization, a level of professional documentation that spoke of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Margaret moved to the first table and began examining samples systematically. Each container held a rock or mineral specimen, and each was labeled with location coordinates, depth, date of collection, and preliminary composition notes. She picked up one marked Sample 17C and held it up to the light. The rock was streaked with gold, visible veins running through gray stone like lightning frozen in time. "Frank, look at this one," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the cold space. "This isn't just flecks. This is significant gold content." Frank was examining a different table, this one covered with core samples, long cylinders of rock extracted from deep drilling. These go down 200, 300 feet. He wasn't just picking rocks off the surface. He was doing professional geological surveys. They worked methodically, moving from table to table, container to container. The samples progressed logically, organized by location and type. First came the basic rock samples, dozens of them showing various mineral contents. Then came the more refined samples, pieces that had been partially processed or tested, showing higher concentrations of valuable materials. One entire table was dedicated to what the labels identified as platinum group metals. Margaret didn't know much about platinum, but she knew it was valuable, used in everything from jewelry to catalytic converters to medical equipment. The samples on this table gleamed with a silvery white luster that seemed to glow even in the artificial light. "This is insane," Frank said, standing before the platinum table. "Do you know how rare platinum is? Most of the world's supply comes from just a few places: South Africa, Russia, a bit from Canada. And Samuel found deposits here in Alaska?" They moved into the eastern arm of the cellar, where the gemstones waited. Under the bright LED lights, the stones were even more spectacular than they'd appeared in flashlight beams. The sapphires ranged from deep midnight blue to rare pinkish-orange stones called padparadscha. The emeralds were a green so pure and deep it almost hurt to look at them. And the diamonds, rough and uncut but unmistakable, sat in their cases like frozen stars. Margaret found a magnifying loupe on a nearby shelf and examined one of the larger sapphires through the glass case. Even with her untrained eye, she could see the clarity, the depth of color, the quality that would make this stone worth a fortune once cut and polished. "These aren't just samples," she said slowly. "These are showcase pieces, the best of what he found. He was keeping the most valuable specimens here as proof." In the western arm of the cellar, they found something unexpected: native Alaskan artifacts. Not many, but each one carefully preserved and documented. A carved ivory figure of a seal, stone tools that looked ancient, a beautiful basket woven from what the label identified as spruce root. Each artifact had notes explaining where it had been found during Samuel's survey work, along with notations that he had reported the findings to the appropriate tribal authorities and cultural resource offices. "He respected the land," Margaret said, touching the glass case protecting the ivory carving. "He found these during his work, but he preserved them properly, documented them, made sure the cultural history was protected." Frank had moved to the southern arm of the cellar, and Margaret heard him let out a low whistle. She joined him and understood why. This section was different from all the others. Here the walls were lined with filing cabinets, and a large desk sat in the center. Maps covered the walls, not tourist maps, but detailed topographical surveys with overlays of geological data. On the desk sat more binders, leather-bound journals, and stacks of correspondence. Frank opened the first journal carefully, as if it might crumble at his touch. Inside, Samuel's handwriting filled page after page. The first entry was dated June 2, 1967. "Arrived at the new survey site today," Frank read aloud. "The company wants basic topographical data for potential road construction, but I noticed something in the initial core samples. Mineral content that doesn't match the regional geological surveys. I'm going to do some additional testing on my own time. Probably nothing, but it's worth investigating." Margaret pulled out another journal, this one from the early 1970s. She flipped through pages of technical notes, hand-drawn geological cross-sections and calculations. Then she found an entry that made her stop. March 14, 1972. "I've now confirmed what I suspected. There is a massive mineral deposit beneath this region, unlike anything in the published geological records. The formation appears to extend for at least 12 square miles, possibly more. I need to do more testing, but preliminary analysis suggests deposits of gold, platinum, sapphires, emeralds, and rare earth elements. If I'm right about the scale, this could be one of the most significant mineral discoveries in North American history." "If he's right?" Frank looked at the tables of samples. He was right. All of this proves he was right. Margaret continued reading. "The question is what to do with this information. I've filed my standard reports with the survey company and the state geological office. But something doesn't feel right. I received a visit today from two men who claimed to be from the Regional Mining Authority. They asked very specific questions about my work in the northern sectors. How did they know to ask about that specific area? I haven't submitted those reports yet. The journals chronicled years of growing suspicion. Samuel documented his surveys with scientific precision, but he also documented something else: a pattern of interference. Reports that went missing. Core samples that disappeared from his office. Visits from corporate representatives who somehow knew about his findings before they should have been public. An entry from 1974 was particularly revealing. Met with James Halliday from Blackridge Mining today. He offered me $50,000 for all my survey data from the northern region. When I asked why, he said they were looking to expand operations and wanted to save time on preliminary surveys. $50,000 is a year's salary for me. But the way he made the offer, like he expected me to jump at it without questions, tells me my data is worth far more than that to them. I declined. His expression when I said no was concerning. They knew, Margaret said, looking up from the journal. The mining corporations knew Samuel had found something and they were trying to buy his information cheap. Frank had opened one of the filing cabinets and was reading through correspondence. Look at this. Letters from the State Geological Office losing his reports. Requests for his data being delayed indefinitely. And here, a letter from someone in the Bureau of Land Management saying his mineral rights claim in the northern region was being reviewed for compliance and would be suspended pending further investigation. Samuel wrote notes in the margin. No valid reason given. Claim filed properly. Why are they stalling? They spent hours reading through Samuel's documentation. A picture emerged of a man who had made a significant discovery, tried to report it through proper channels, and found himself systematically blocked. Not openly opposed, that would have been too obvious, but delayed, diverted, lost in bureaucratic processes that seemed designed to prevent his findings from becoming official. A journal entry from 1976 explained Samuel's conclusion. I've been naive. I thought science was about discovery and truth, but I'm learning it's also about money and control. Someone, probably Blackridge Mining, possibly others, has recognized the potential of what I've found. They can't steal my data outright, that would be too obvious. But they can delay and suppress it until they can establish their own claims to the region through legal maneuvering. They'll file claims on adjacent properties, create enough legal confusion that by the time my findings are official, they'll have positioned themselves to control development. Meanwhile, they've offered me what they consider fair compensation for my silence. When I refused, they made it clear my career would suffer. I've been dropped from several survey contracts. My reputation is being quietly undermined. I'm being warned off without anyone saying the words. Margaret felt anger building in her chest. Samuel had been honest, had tried to do things the right way, and had been punished for it. It was familiar. She and Frank had tried to do things honestly too, and their own children had taken advantage of that honesty. A letter from 1978, addressed to multiple government offices and marked with stamps showing it had never been delivered, laid out Samuel's final attempt to make his findings public. He detailed the extent of the mineral deposits, provided coordinates, attached preliminary assay reports. He requested official recognition of his discovery and proper surveying of the region to establish accurate claim boundaries. Samuel had written a note at the bottom of his carbon copy. Never received responses from any office. When I called to follow up, I was told no such letters were in their files. Either the most comprehensive mail failure in history, or someone is intercepting correspondence. I'm now convinced this is deliberate suppression. The final journal, dated from the late 1990s through to 2018, showed Samuel's shift in strategy. He stopped trying to make his findings public. Instead, he spent decades meticulously documenting everything, extracting select samples to prove the deposit's existence, and preserving it all in this underground vault. November 3rd, 1998. I've built the ice cellar. The permafrost here runs deep, and the construction allows me to maintain temperatures that will preserve samples indefinitely. If I can't get the discovery recognized now, I'll preserve the proof for whenever the time is right. Maybe in 20 years, maybe in 50, but the truth won't disappear just because powerful people find it inconvenient. July 22nd, 2003. I'm now 74, still in good health, but I'm realistic about time. I need to think about what happens to this discovery after I'm gone. I've reviewed my family connections. Most are back in the lower 48, and I barely know them. But I remember Frank and Margaret Hayes from those family reunions. Good people. They ran a hardware store, built something real with their own hands. They'll understand that this discovery matters not because of its value, but because of what it represents. Truth that shouldn't be buried because it's inconvenient for the powerful. Margaret's hands trembled as she read Samuel's words. He had chosen them deliberately, thoughtfully, not randomly. He had seen something in them 3 decades ago that made him believe they would be the right guardians for his life's work. "Listen to this," Frank said, reading from a letter Samuel had drafted but apparently never sent. "To whoever inherits this property, I am leaving you more than land. I am leaving you proof of one of the most significant mineral discoveries in North American history, and evidence of how that discovery was systematically suppressed by corporate and governmental interests. The samples in this cellar represent decades of work. The documentation shows both the extent of the deposits and the pattern of interference I encountered. The estimated value of the full deposit, based on conservative projections and current market prices, exceeds $200 million. But the value isn't the point. The point is truth. The point is that ordinary people deserve to benefit from the resources of the land, not just corporations. The point is that discoveries should be recognized based on merit, not hidden because they threaten established interests. Use this information wisely. Honor the land, honor the people who live here, and don't let them bury the truth again. What happens next will transform their understanding completely. Reveal the full conspiracy that cost Samuel his career, and force them to decide whether 2 elderly people can take on an entire system built to protect the powerful. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. They found the final piece of documentation in a locked drawer of Samuel's desk. Frank used the smallest key from the ring to open it, and inside was a folder marked "For legal action, keep secure." Inside were assay reports from independent laboratories, dated from various years between 1970 and 2015. Professional geological reports that confirmed everything Samuel had claimed. These weren't his personal assessments. These were certified analyses from recognized authorities, complete with official stamps and signatures. He sent samples out for professional testing, Margaret said, reading through the reports. Multiple labs over multiple decades. They all confirm the same thing: exceptional mineral concentrations, high-quality gemstones, commercially viable deposits of platinum and rare earth elements. He had the proof. He always had the proof. Also in the folder were documents showing Samuel's mineral rights claims for various properties in the region. Some had been approved, many had been suspended or denied for various technical reasons. A legal brief drafted by a lawyer in the 1980s argued that the denials were improper, but it appeared no court case had ever been filed. There was a letter from the lawyer: "Mr. Whitmore, I've reviewed your case and believe you have strong grounds for legal action. However, I must be honest about the challenges. You would be going up against Blackridge Mining, which has essentially unlimited legal resources. The case could take years, potentially decades. The costs would be substantial, and there's no guarantee of success. Powerful interests are clearly invested in preventing your claims from being recognized. I will represent you if you wish to proceed, but I want you to understand what you're facing." Samuel's handwritten note on the letter said, "Too expensive. Would bankrupt me before reaching resolution. Better to preserve evidence and wait for a better opportunity. Margaret and Frank sat at Samuel's desk, surrounded by decades of documentation, and tried to process what they were learning. This wasn't just a mineral discovery. It was a decades-long conspiracy to suppress that discovery, to protect corporate interests, to deny an honest man recognition for his life's work. "How much of this is actually still here?" Frank asked suddenly. "The samples prove the deposits exist, but are they still accessible? The claims were filed 40, 50 years ago. What's the status now?" Margaret began searching through the filing cabinets more systematically. She found a folder labeled Current Property Status, updated 2017, and pulled it out eagerly. Inside was recent documentation showing that Samuel had maintained ownership of the cabin property and its surrounding 40 acres continuously since 1965. More importantly, there were updated mineral rights claims, properly filed and approved for this specific property. The claims had been renewed regularly, most recently in 2017, just 4 years before Samuel's death. "He maintained the rights," Margaret said, reading quickly, "not to the full deposit area that spread across multiple properties, some private, some state land, but to this 40 acres which according to his maps sits directly above one of the richest portions of the deposit. He gave up fighting for the larger claims, but he kept this one current and legal." There was more. A geological report from 2015, commissioned by Samuel and prepared by an independent consultant, provided updated valuations based on modern mineral prices. The report confirmed Samuel's earlier assessments and actually increased the estimated values. Technology had improved. Rare earth elements had become more valuable. The gemstone market had expanded. The final page of the report provided the number that would change everything. Based on survey data provided by the client, geological analysis of core samples, assay reports from certified laboratories, and current market valuations, the estimated total value of extractable minerals within the surveyed deposit area is between $265 million and $320 million, depending on extraction efficiency and market conditions at time of sale. $265 million, minimum. Margaret felt dizzy. She looked around the cellar, at the samples Samuel had spent a lifetime collecting, at the journals documenting his struggles, at the proof of corporate suppression. This wasn't a fantasy or a scam. This was real, verified by professional geologists and certified laboratories. This was actually real. "Frank," she said, her voice shaking, "we need to understand what this means. Legally, what do we actually own here?" Frank was already pulling out more documents. "The cabin and 40 acres are ours, free and clear. Samuel left them to us in his will, and according to this deed there are no liens or encumbrances. The mineral rights for this specific property are also ours. They transfer with the land. So legally we own the surface rights and the subsurface mineral rights for this 40 acres. But the deposit extends beyond our property." According to Samuel's maps, yes. The main formation runs under multiple properties. Some are other private holdings. Some are state land. Some are on territory where native corporations hold subsurface rights. He pulled out a detailed map showing the full extent of Samuel's surveyed deposit area. Their 40 acres was marked clearly, sitting above what Samuel had labeled primary high-value zone. Estimated 30% of total deposit value. Margaret did quick mental math. 30% of $265 million was roughly $80 million, just from their property, from land they now legally owned. "Oh my God," she whispered. Frank was reading more of Samuel's notes. "He planned this. Look, he specifically chose this 40-acre parcel because it sat above the richest portion of the deposit. He could have claimed land anywhere, but he chose here, and he maintained it continuously, never let the mineral rights lapse, kept everything current and legal. He was protecting our inheritance." They sat in silence for a long moment, the LED lights humming overhead, the cold pressing in from the permafrost surrounding them. Margaret thought about their apartment in Portland with its thin walls, thought about the $73,000 that was all that remained from selling their life's work, thought about David's voice on the phone, dismissive and condescending. Just sign it over to the state and forget about it. If they had listened to their children, they would have never come here. They would have signed away the property rights from Portland, probably for pennies compared to its actual value. Someone would have bought it at a tax sale or a discount estate settlement, and that someone would have eventually discovered what lay beneath. The discovery Samuel had protected for 50 years would have been lost, given away because Margaret and Frank had been convinced they were too old to make their own decisions. "They almost took this from us," Frank said quietly, and Margaret knew he was thinking the same thing. "If we'd listened to them, if we'd been too scared to come here, if we'd just done what they said." "But we didn't," Margaret said firmly. "We came anyway. We found it anyway. This is ours." Frank pulled out another journal, this one Samuel's most recent, and flipped to one of the last entries, dated just months before his death. March 8, 2021. "I'm 91 now. My hands shake. My memory isn't what it was. The lawyers are right. I need to move to assisted living. But before I go, I need to finalize what happens to the discovery. I've updated my will. Everything goes to Frank and Margaret Hayes. I barely know them, really. Saw them twice, maybe 3 times at family gatherings decades ago, but I remember them clearly. They were kind. They worked hard. They built something honest. And when I heard through the family grapevine that their own children had taken advantage of them, convinced them to sell their business for far less than it was worth, I knew they were the right choice. They understand betrayal. They understand what it's like when powerful people take what you've built. They'll understand why this discovery matters. They'll understand that it's not about the money. It's about standing up to the forces that try to keep ordinary people powerless. If they're still alive when I die, they'll inherit everything. The cabin, the land, the samples, the documentation, the truth. And maybe, just maybe, they'll be brave enough to do what I couldn't, make the discovery public and fight for what's right." Margaret was crying now, tears running down her face and freezing in the cold air. Samuel had known. He'd known about their hardware store, about their children's betrayal, about their struggles. And he'd chosen them anyway, not despite those struggles, but because of them. "He trusted us," she said through her tears. "He believed we could do this." Frank reached over and took her hand. His eyes were wet too. "Can we? Margaret, this is so much bigger than us. Mining corporations, government agencies, legal battles, millions of dollars. We're 73 and 76 years old. We don't know anything about mineral extraction or corporate law or any of this." Margaret looked around the cellar one more time. 50 years of work, thousands of samples, meticulous documentation, proof of both the discovery and the conspiracy to suppress it. Samuel had done all the hard work. He'd collected the evidence, fought the battles, preserved the truth. All they had to do was decide what to do with it. She thought about their children, David and Jessica, so certain their parents were incompetent, so quick to take control and strip away autonomy, so dismissive of everything Margaret and Frank had built. If she and Frank walked away from this discovery, if they let fear win, they would be proving their children right. They would be accepting that they really were too old, too scared, too small to matter. But if they moved forward, if they found a way to make this discovery public, to extract these resources, to turn Samuel's suppressed truth into reality, they would prove something else entirely. They would prove that age didn't mean powerlessness, that being underestimated was sometimes an advantage, that ordinary people could stand up to extraordinary forces if they were brave enough to try. "We need help," Margaret said finally. "We need experts who can verify what we've found, lawyers who can protect our rights, people who understand mining and geology and all the things we don't. We need to be smart about this." "And we need to be careful," Frank added. Samuel documented what happened when he tried to go public. The interference, the suppression, the threats to his career. If we start making noise about this, we'll face the same pressures, maybe worse. Margaret stood up, her joints protesting after sitting so long in the cold. Then we don't make noise, not yet. We verify everything first. We build a legal foundation. We find partners we can trust. We do this right, the way Samuel tried to do it right, but this time, we succeed. She looked at Frank. We owe it to Samuel. He protected this for 50 years waiting for the right people. He chose us because he believed we could do what he couldn't, and we owe it to ourselves. Our children took our business because they convinced us we were too old and weak to fight back. Well, I'm done being told I'm too old. I'm done accepting that we don't matter. We have a chance here. A chance to prove everyone wrong. To build something meaningful. To make a difference. I don't want to waste it. Frank stood slowly, his weathered face serious. It won't be easy. They'll fight us. Corporations with unlimited money, lawyers who know every trick, maybe even government agencies that don't want this discovery to upset their relationships with existing mining interests. We could lose everything. We could end up worse off than we are now. Or, Margaret said, we could win. We could turn Samuel's discovery into reality. We could extract these resources ethically and use the money to benefit the communities here. We could prove that ordinary people can take on powerful interests and come out on top. We could build something that actually matters. They stood together in the cold cellar, surrounded by 50 years of preserved truth, and made their decision. They would move forward. They would find a way to make the discovery public, to honor Samuel's trust, to prove their children wrong. They would face whatever came with the same determination that had kept them married for 51 years, that had built a hardware store from nothing, that had survived every challenge life threw at them. Margaret reached out and took Frank's hand. So, she said, how do two elderly people take on the mining industry? Frank smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him in months. Very carefully, and we start by not telling anyone in our family anything. They spent the rest of the day in the cellar, organizing documents, taking photographs of key samples, and making lists of what they would need. Geological experts to verify the findings, lawyers who specialized in mineral rights, financial advisors who understood resource extraction, environmental consultants who could help them develop an ethical extraction plan. As evening fell and they finally climbed back up the stairs into the cabin, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt since before they'd sold the hardware store. She felt purpose, direction, power. They had gone from being dismissed and diminished to being the guardians of one of the most significant mineral discoveries in modern American history. The cabin felt warmer now, more like home than it had the night before. They made dinner from the supplies Samuel had left, and Frank started a fire in the massive stone fireplace. They sat together on the old sofa, eating simple food and watching flames dance against the hearth, and talked about the future. First thing tomorrow, Margaret said, we need to find a way to communicate with the outside world. Research geologists, find lawyers, figure out who we can trust. The nearest town is 40 miles away, Frank reminded her. Robert said cell service doesn't reach out here. Then we drive to town. We find an internet cafe or a library. We start making connections carefully, quietly, without broadcasting what we've found. She paused. And we don't contact David or Jessica or Thomas. Not yet, maybe not ever. This is ours. Samuel left it to us, and after what they did, they don't deserve to know about it until we're ready. Frank nodded. Agreed, though when they eventually find out... They'll be furious, Margaret finished. They'll claim we're being manipulated or we're not competent to handle this or we owe them somehow. And we'll tell them no. We'll tell them this is what happens when you dismiss people. You miss what they're capable of. Outside the cabin windows, the northern lights began their nightly dance, green and purple ribbons flowing across the black sky. Margaret watched them, marveling at the beauty, at the strangeness of finding herself here at 73 years old, sitting on a fortune she never imagined, facing challenges she never expected. "Are you scared?" Frank asked quietly. "Terrified," Margaret admitted, "but also more alive than I've felt in years. Our children told us our lives were essentially over, that we should accept being managed and diminished and pushed aside. And now we're sitting on top of $265 million worth of proof that they were wrong." She turned to look at Frank. "I don't know if we can actually do this. I don't know if we're strong enough or smart enough or brave enough. But I know I want to try. I know that Samuel believed in us, and I want to prove he was right. And I know that if we don't at least try, I'll regret it for whatever time we have left." Frank reached over and squeezed her hand. "Then we try. Tomorrow, we start figuring out how. Tonight, we just sit here and accept that our lives just changed completely." They sat together in the firelight, two elderly people who had been written off by their own children, who had lost everything they'd built, who had come to Alaska expecting nothing more than a broken cabin and a chance to escape depression. Instead, they'd found Samuel Whitmore's life work, proof of massive mineral wealth, evidence of corporate conspiracy, and a trust placed in them by a man who believed they deserved a second chance. The path forward would be difficult. They knew that. There would be obstacles, opposition, and dangers they couldn't yet predict. But for the first time in months, Margaret and Frank Hayes weren't just surviving. They were preparing to fight for something that mattered, and that made all the difference. The decision to seek expert verification came on their third day at the cabin. Margaret and Frank had spent 2 more full days in the cellar, documenting everything, taking photographs, trying to make sense of the technical geological reports. But they both knew they were out of their depth. They needed someone who actually understood what they were looking at. The drive to Fairbanks took 3 hours on rough roads. They found the public library and used their computers to research geological consultants in Alaska. Margaret made a list of names while Frank looked up mineral rights lawyers. They needed to be careful about who they contacted. Samuel's documentation made it clear that the wrong people would either try to exploit them or report their findings to corporate interests. After 2 hours of research, they settled on Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, an independent geological consultant based in Anchorage. Her credentials were impeccable. Doctorate from Colorado School of Mines, 30 years of field experience, and most importantly, a reputation for working with small operators and indigenous communities rather than major mining corporations. Several articles mentioned her refusal to sign non-compete agreements with large firms, choosing independence over higher pay. Margaret used a payphone outside the library, feeling ridiculous but not wanting any digital trail of their search. She had found the doctor's number on her professional website. "Dr. Okonkwo, my name is Margaret Hayes. My husband and I recently inherited property in interior Alaska that includes what appears to be geological samples and survey data. We need someone to verify the findings, but we need absolute confidentiality." There was a pause. "What kind of samples are we talking about?" Margaret chose her words carefully. "Mineral specimens, gemstones, core samples, extensive documentation from a surveyor named Samuel Whitmore, who worked in the region for 50 years. We need to know if what we're looking at is legitimate." Another pause, longer this time. "Samuel Whitmore? I knew that name. He was legendary in certain circles, a surveyor who supposedly found something significant but could never get it recognized. Most people thought he was either mistaken or crazy. Where are you calling from?" "A payphone in Fairbanks." "Smart. Mrs. Hayes, I need to ask you something directly. Have you been in contact with any mining corporations about this?" "No. We've told no one except you." Keep it that way. I can be there in 3 days. Don't call me again, I'll call you. What number can I reach you at? Margaret gave her the number for the general store in the nearest town, explaining they had no phone at the cabin. Patricia said she'd call there in exactly 72 hours to arrange the meeting. 3 days later, a rugged jeep pulled up to the cabin. Dr. Patricia Okonkwo was in her early 60s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades in the field. She shook hands firmly with both of them, her grip assessing. "Show me," she said without preamble. Margaret and Frank led her to the cellar. They watched her face as they descended the stairs and opened the doors to the vault. Patricia's professional mask slipped when she saw the tables of samples, the cases of gemstones, the walls covered with maps and surveys. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered, "it's all real." Patricia spent 4 days in the cellar. She brought equipment from her jeep, spectrometers, microscopes, testing solutions, portable assay equipment. She examined hundreds of samples, cross-referenced Samuel's maps with modern geological surveys, ran calculations that covered page after page of her notebooks. Margaret and Frank brought her meals and coffee and watched a professional confirm what they'd hoped and feared. On the morning of the 5th day, Patricia emerged from the cellar and sat at the cabin's pine table. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were bright with excitement and concern. "It's real," she said without preamble. "All of it. The samples are genuine, the quality is exceptional, and based on Samuel's survey data and my analysis, I believe his estimates were actually conservative. This is one of the most significant mineral discoveries I've ever seen." Margaret's hands trembled as she set down her coffee mug. "How significant?" Patricia pulled out her tablet and showed them digital models and calculations. Samuel mapped approximately 12 square miles of deposit. I think it extends closer to 18 square miles. The concentration of minerals is extraordinary. The gemstones alone represent one of the most important sapphire and emerald discoveries in North American history. The platinum group metals are even more valuable, and the rare earth elements. She shook her head. Those are increasingly crucial for modern technology. The United States is almost entirely dependent on foreign sources. This discovery could have national significance. Frank leaned forward. "What's it worth?" Patricia met his eyes. "If extracted ethically and efficiently, controlling for market impact, I'd estimate between $300 and $400 million, possibly more." The number hung in the air like something solid. Margaret thought about the $73,000 her children had left them with after taking their hardware store. This was a different universe entirely. "What do we do now?" Margaret asked. "That depends on what you want," Patricia said. "You could sell the information to a mining corporation. They'd pay handsomely, maybe 20 to 30 million for verified survey data and mineral rights to your property. They'd handle everything, and you'd be comfortable for life." "But," Frank prompted. But Samuel specifically warned against that approach in his documentation, and based on my experience, he was right. Major corporations would strip this deposit as quickly as possible, employ minimal local labor, export the profits, and leave environmental damage. The communities in this region would see almost no benefit, and you'd have no control over how it's extracted. "What's the alternative?" Margaret asked. "Form your own company. Partner with local native corporations who have expertise in land rights and community relations. Extract slowly and sustainably. Use the profits to benefit the region that's giving up these resources." Patricia paused. "It's harder. It takes longer. It means fighting people with more money and power. But it's the right way." Margaret looked at Frank. They didn't need to speak to know what the other was thinking. Their children had taught them what happened when you took the easy path, when you let others decide what you were worth. "How do we start?" Frank asked. "First, we need a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. someone who specializes in mineral rights, indigenous partnerships, and who has experience fighting corporations. Patricia pulled out her phone. I know someone. Sarah Blackfeather. She's Tlingit, practiced law for 25 years, and she's taken on every major mining company in Alaska at one point or another. She's expensive, but she's the best. We have $73,000, Margaret said. Is that enough? For a retainer, yes. For everything you'll need? Patricia shook her head. You'll need geological surveys, environmental assessments, legal filings, community consultations. We're talking hundreds of thousands before you extract anything. Margaret felt the familiar weight of impossibility, but Frank stood up and walked to the window. We used some of the samples Samuel preserved, he said. The loose gemstones and high-grade specimens. Enough to finance the next steps without revealing the main deposit. Patricia nodded slowly. That would work. I know collectors and refineries who deal in estate mineral collections. They'll pay fair prices and keep it discreet. We could probably raise $200,000 to $300,000 from what's in that cellar. Over the next 2 weeks, Patricia handled the sales quietly. The buyers were international collectors who paid in discreet transfers. $247,000 appeared in an account Patricia helped them establish under the company name Hayes Geological Resources, LLC. But despite their caution, word began to leak. It started small. A mention at a mineral collectors conference, a question from a refinery about the source of such high-quality specimens, a conversation overheard in a Fairbanks bar where Patricia met with one of her contacts. The first indication that their secret was compromised came when a black SUV pulled up to the cabin on a gray November morning. 2 men in expensive outdoor gear stepped out, their boots too clean, their smiles too practiced. Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, the taller one said. My name is Richard Sutton. I'm with Blackridge Mining Corporation. Do you have a few minutes to talk? Margaret's blood ran cold. Blackridge Mining, the same company mentioned throughout Samuel's journals, the same corporation that had tried to buy his data, had suppressed his findings, had made his life difficult for decades. How did you find us? Frank asked. Richard's smile didn't waver. We make it our business to know about geological activity in regions where we have interests. We've heard rumors about some interesting mineral samples appearing on the market. Samples that match the geological signature of this area. We thought we'd reach out directly. We're not interested in selling, Margaret said firmly. You haven't heard our offer yet, the second man interjected. His name tag read James Halliday, the same name that appeared in Samuel's journals from the 1970s. Could it be the same person, or was it his son? We're prepared to offer $5 million for your property and any geological data you may have acquired. Cash payment, immediate transfer. You could be millionaires by this time next week. $5 million. A year ago, that would have seemed like all the money in the world. But Margaret had spent weeks reading Samuel's documentation. She knew what they were actually sitting on. $5 million was insultingly low. No, she said. Richard's smile thinned. Mrs. Hayes, I understand you recently inherited this property. You're probably not familiar with the complexities of mineral extraction, the regulations, the environmental assessments, the legal hurdles. Blackridge has the expertise and resources to handle all of that. You'd be taking on a tremendous burden if you tried to develop this property yourselves. We're not interested, Frank repeated. James leaned forward slightly. Mr. Hayes, let me be frank. You're both in your 70s. No disrespect intended, but do you really want to spend your remaining years fighting legal battles and dealing with regulatory agencies? Take the $5 million. Enjoy your retirement. Let professionals handle the complicated work. There it was again. The subtle message that they were too old, too incompetent, too weak. The same message their children had given them. Margaret felt anger building in her chest. Gentlemen, she said, her voice cold, this property is not for sale. The mineral rights are not for sale. We're not interested in your offer now or in the future. Please leave. Richard stood slowly. I understand this is a shock. You need time to think. But Mrs. Hayes, Mr. Hayes, I strongly encourage you to reconsider. The mining industry in Alaska can be challenging for independent operators. Regulations change. Environmental groups file lawsuits. Permits get delayed. It's much easier to work with established companies who have relationships with the relevant agencies. Is that a threat? Frank asked quietly. Not at all, Richard said smoothly. Just friendly advice. We'll be in touch. They left, but their visit cast a shadow over everything. That evening, Margaret called Sarah Blackfeather, the lawyer Patricia had recommended. Sarah listened to the story, asked sharp questions, and then said something that made Margaret's stomach clench. They'll be back, and next time it won't be friendly. When Blackridge wants something, they don't stop at polite offers. You need legal protection immediately. Sarah arrived 2 days later, a formidable woman in her 50s with black hair streaked with silver and eyes that missed nothing. She reviewed Samuel's documentation, examined the samples, studied the mineral rights claims, and nodded approvingly. Samuel did this right. Everything is properly filed. The documentation is thorough. You have legitimate claims. She paused. But the moment word gets out fully, you'll face pressure from mining corporations, state regulators who favor established operators, and people who think you're too old to know what you're doing. We've heard that before, Frank said quietly. Sarah smiled grimly. I'm sure you have. Which is why we're going to build an unassailable legal structure before going fully public. We'll establish your company properly, file all permits, conduct environmental assessments, and reach out to native corporations about partnerships. Everything by the book, fast and quiet. The legal work took 3 months. Sarah filed permits with state and federal agencies. Patricia conducted additional surveys to supplement Samuel's data. They hired an environmental consulting firm run by a Gwich'in woman named Grace, who understood both the scientific requirements and the cultural significance of the land. During this time, the pressure increased. Blackridge Mining filed a challenge to one of their permit applications, claiming environmental concerns. A state regulatory official called to discuss their plans, asking pointed questions about their experience and qualifications. Letters arrived at the cabin, some offering to buy the property, others warning about the dangers of independent mining operations. Then, on a cold February morning, Margaret's phone rang. The number was Portland. David. Mom, he said, his voice tight. We need to talk. I know what you're doing in Alaska. Margaret's heart sank. How? A friend of mine works in mineral rights law in Seattle. Your LLC filing and permit applications came across his network. $300 to $400 million in mineral deposits, Mom? And you didn't think to tell us? There it was, the real reason for the call. David, this is complex. We're still working out. I've spoken with Jessica and Thomas. We all agree. You and Dad aren't capable of managing something this significant. You need to step aside and let us handle this properly. Margaret felt fury rising. Handle it properly, like you handled our hardware store? That was different. This is real money, Mom, serious money. You're going to make mistakes that will cost all of us millions. We're filing for conservatorship again. This time we have real grounds. You're trying to run a mining operation at your age. Any judge will see that's unreasonable. You're not taking this from us, Margaret said, her voice shaking with anger. This is our property, our inheritance, our decision. We'll see what the court says, David replied coldly. We're also filing a claim against the estate. Samuel Whitmore was our relative too. We have rights to the inheritance. Margaret hung up. Her hands were trembling. Frank, who'd been listening, pulled her close. They can't take it, he said. Sarah will stop them. But the legal assault was brutal. David, Jessica, and Thomas filed for conservatorship, claiming their parents were mentally incompetent. They filed a claim against Samuel's estate, arguing the inheritance should be divided among all relatives. They contacted the media with stories about elderly parents being taken advantage of by unscrupulous consultants. Sarah's response was fierce and immediate. She filed motions to dismiss the conservatorship case, pointing out that Margaret and Frank had passed independent psychiatric evaluations. She submitted documentation of their careful planning and partnerships with respected organizations. She filed countersuits for elder abuse and harassment. And she suggested something else. Your children are trying to paint you as confused old people being exploited. We need to flip that narrative. We need to show that you're competent, thoughtful, and building something meaningful. We need to go public, but on our terms. Margaret was hesitant. Samuel had spent decades trying to keep the discovery quiet. But Sarah explained that silence only gave their opponents room to control the narrative. If we go public the right way, we protect you. We show that you're working with native corporations, conducting environmental assessments, doing everything properly. We make you sympathetic figures, elderly couple honoring a relative's legacy, and make anyone who opposes you look like bullies. Patricia agreed. And we can use the attention to attract other partners, indigenous organizations, environmental groups, ethical investment funds. Build a coalition too strong for Blackridge to push around. The media strategy began with a single interview. Sarah arranged for a reporter from the Anchorage Daily News to visit the cabin. Margaret and Frank told their story honestly. The hardware store, the betrayal by their children, the unexpected inheritance, Samuel's discovery and his suppression by corporate interests, their decision to honor his wishes by developing the resources ethically. The article appeared on a Sunday morning. Elderly couple discovers $300 million mineral deposit. Faces pressure from children and corporations. It included photos of Margaret and Frank at the cabin, quotes from Patricia verifying the discovery's significance, and statements from Sarah about the legal battles. The response was overwhelming. Within days, the story went national. News outlets across the country picked it up. Magazine writers requested interviews. Documentary filmmakers wanted to tell the story. The narrative was irresistible. Elderly couple betrayed by greedy children, inheriting vast wealth, standing up to powerful mining corporations while trying to do the right thing. But it also brought danger. More letters arrived, some supportive, others threatening. Someone vandalized the cabin while they were in Fairbanks for meetings, spray painting "Leave" on the door. A truck tried to run them off the road on the highway, though they couldn't prove it was intentional. Sarah reported that Blackridge had increased their legal opposition, filing challenges to every permit application, claiming environmental violations that didn't exist, lobbying state regulators to deny their requests. The turning point came from an unexpected source. An elderly native Alaskan man named Thomas Anaktuvuk showed up at the cabin one morning in March. He was Koyukon Athabaskan, in his late 80s, moving slowly but with dignity. "I knew Samuel Whitmore," he said after Margaret invited him in for coffee. "He surveyed land near our village in the 1970s. Good man, respectful. When he found artifacts, he contacted us properly, protected sacred sites, different from other white surveyors." Thomas pulled out a letter, yellowed with age. "Samuel wrote me this in 1976, asked about the land he was surveying, about our people's connection to it. He wanted to understand the cultural history before extracting resources." Margaret read the letter, her eyes filling with tears. Samuel had written about his discovery in broad terms, asking Thomas for guidance about how to develop resources in ways that would benefit native communities rather than exploit them. "He told me he found something big," Thomas continued. "But he also said powerful companies were trying to suppress it. He asked me what I thought he should do. I told him, protect the truth, but also protect the land. Don't let them strip it bare. Make sure our people benefit." "That's exactly what we want to do," Frank said. "We're trying to partner with native corporations, extract sustainably, use profits for community benefit." Thomas nodded slowly. "I heard about you on the news. Heard about your children trying to take this from you. Heard about the mining companies pressuring you." He set down his coffee cup. "I came here to tell you, our community supports you. The Doyon Native Corporation supports you. We don't want Black Ridge mining here. They strip land and leave nothing. But you're trying to do right by Samuel's wishes. That matters." Over the next weeks, the coalition grew. Thomas introduced them to leaders from Doyon and other native corporations in the region. These organizations had sophisticated legal and business operations, expertise in negotiating with government agencies, and deep commitment to protecting the land while allowing sustainable development. The Doyon representatives were professional but initially skeptical. They'd seen countless prospectors and mining companies make promises they never kept. But when Margaret and Frank presented their proposal, 49% equity for Doyon, full input on extraction methods, 50% of all profits into a community development fund, the skepticism shifted to cautious interest. "This is the most generous split I've ever seen from a mineral rights holder," said the Doyon director of land management. "It's fair," Margaret said firmly. "Samuel discovered these deposits, but they exist on land your ancestors lived on for thousands of years. Fairness matters more than maximum profit." The Doyon partnership changed everything. With a respected native corporation backing their project, environmental groups that usually opposed mining operations offered cautious support. State regulators became more responsive. Even some media coverage shifted from treating them as naive elderly people to recognizing them as serious operators with ethical intentions. But the legal battle with their children intensified. David, Jessica, and Thomas hired aggressive lawyers who painted Margaret and Frank as mentally declining, easily manipulated by consultants who would take their money. They submitted medical records showing Frank's minor memory issues, cited Margaret's age as evidence of impaired judgment, and argued that any reasonable court would recognize that running a mining operation was beyond the capacity of two people in their 70s. The conservatorship hearing was scheduled for late April. Sarah prepared them extensively, but the night before Margaret couldn't sleep. She stood on the cabin porch, watching the northern lights dance overhead, and wondered if they'd been foolish to fight this hard. "Second thoughts?" Frank asked, joining her. "Terrified thoughts," Margaret admitted. "What if the judge agrees with them? What if tomorrow we lose everything, the property, the discovery, our independence? What if they were right all along that we're too old for this?" Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you remember what Samuel wrote in his final journal entry? He said he chose us because we'd been betrayed and would understand what this discovery meant. Not the money, the meaning, standing up to forces that try to keep ordinary people powerless." I remember. "If we lose tomorrow, at least we fought. At least we tried. That's more than we would have done a year ago when we were sitting in that terrible apartment thinking our lives were over." He took her hand. "Whatever happens, we proved them wrong about us being too old to matter. We built something meaningful. That counts for something." The courtroom was packed. Margaret and Frank sat with Sarah at the defendant's table, while David, Jessica, and Thomas sat with their legal team on the other side. Margaret tried to make eye contact with her children, but they looked away. The hearing lasted 6 hours. David's lawyers presented medical records, cited statistics about cognitive decline in elderly people, and argued that managing a multi-million-dollar mining operation required capabilities Margaret and Frank no longer possessed. They brought in an expert witness, a geriatric psychiatrist who testified that people in their 70s showed reduced judgment and were vulnerable to exploitation. Sarah's response was devastating. She presented the independent psychiatric evaluations showing Margaret and Frank were fully competent. She brought Patricia to testify about their careful planning and intelligent decision-making. She had Thomas Anaktuvuk speak about their respectful approach to Native concerns. She showed documentation of their meticulous organization and partnership development. Most powerfully, she let Margaret speak. Margaret stood in the witness box, looked directly at the judge, and told the truth. Your Honor, my children claim I'm not capable of managing my own affairs. But 6 months ago, they convinced me to sell a business I'd run successfully for 47 years for a fraction of its value. They put us in a terrible apartment and told us to be grateful. They called maybe once a month and only when it was convenient for them. They dismissed every decision we made as confused or naive. She paused. Then we inherited property in Alaska. They told us not to bother, that it was worthless. We came anyway. We discovered something Samuel Whitmore had protected for 50 years. We sought expert advice. We built partnerships with respected organizations. We're developing the resources ethically and sustainably. We're honoring Samuel's wishes to benefit Native communities. Every step has been careful, legal, and thoughtful. She looked at her children for the first time. I'm not incompetent. I'm not being exploited. I'm doing exactly what my children taught me to do. I'm refusing to let others decide my worth or control my life. If that makes me incompetent in their eyes, then perhaps they need to reconsider what competence means. The judge was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. I've reviewed all the evidence, heard all the testimony, and I find no basis for conservatorship. Mrs. and Mr. Hayes have demonstrated exemplary competence in managing complex affairs. They've built appropriate partnerships, sought expert guidance, and made thoughtful decisions. The petition is denied. He paused, looking at David, Jessica, and Thomas. I'll add that it appears the petitioners are more concerned with potential inheritance than with their parents' welfare. This court does not look kindly on such motivations. Margaret felt her knees go weak with relief. Sarah steadied her, smiling. They had won. Outside the courthouse, media had gathered. Margaret stood with Frank, Sarah, Patricia, and Thomas Anaktavuk, and made a brief statement. Today's ruling affirms what we've always known, that age doesn't equal incompetence. My husband and I are building something meaningful from the legacy Samuel Whitmore left us. We're doing it ethically, sustainably, and in partnership with the communities who call Alaska home. We're proving that it's never too late to start something important, and that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest advantage of all. The story went viral. Video of Margaret's statement was shared millions of times. News outlets across the country covered the ruling. Letters of support poured in from elderly people across America who felt dismissed and powerless, who saw Margaret and Frank as symbols of resistance against ageism. More importantly, the ruling and publicity brought new allies. Ethical investment funds reached out, offering to finance the extraction operation in exchange for minority stakes. Environmental organizations that had been skeptical now offered their expertise in sustainable mining practices. Academic institutions wanted to study their partnership model. Black Ridge Mining, facing increasing public scrutiny and negative publicity, quietly withdrew their permit challenges. They released a statement saying they respected the Hayes' right to develop their property and wished them success. It was a corporate retreat disguised as magnanimity. Back at the cabin that night, Margaret and Frank sat on the porch with Patricia, Sarah, Thomas, and several representatives from Doyon. They toasted their legal victory with whiskey Thomas brought, traditional Alaskan homebrew that burned going down but warmed from within. You did something remarkable, Thomas said. Not just winning the court case, you brought people together. Native corporations, environmental groups, elderly rights advocates, ethical investors. You built a coalition around doing things right. That's powerful. Margaret looked around at these people who had become more than colleagues. They were friends, allies, a chosen family that respected rather than diminished them. A year ago, she'd been sitting in a cramped Portland apartment thinking her life was over. Now she was in Alaska, surrounded by people who believed in what they were building, who saw her and Frank as partners rather than problems. Samuel chose well, Patricia said, raising her glass. He knew what he was doing when he left this to you. Margaret smiled, tears in her eyes. We're just trying to honor his trust and prove to ourselves that we still matter." "You do more than matter," Sarah said firmly. "You're changing how people think about age and capability. Every elderly person who sees your story feels a little more powerful, a little less willing to be dismissed. That's bigger than the money." As the northern lights began their dance overhead and the spring air carried hints of the coming thaw, Margaret realized Sarah was right. They had started this journey looking for escape from depression and disappointment. They'd found something far more valuable: purpose, power, and proof that their children had been catastrophically wrong about them. The fight wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more obstacles, more people trying to take what they'd built. But sitting here with their chosen family, flush with legal victory and growing support, Margaret and Frank knew they could face whatever came next. They weren't just elderly people anymore. They were pioneers, coalition builders, symbols of resistance against anyone who tried to tell them they were too old to matter. And that transformation, from dismissed to powerful, was worth more than any mineral deposit could ever be. The first extraction began in late May, when the ground had thawed enough to work, but the midnight sun kept temperatures manageable. Margaret stood at the edge of the operation site, watching as careful, precise drilling brought up core samples from 200 feet below the surface. This wasn't strip mining or massive earth-moving equipment. This was surgical extraction, guided by Samuel's maps and Patricia's expertise, designed to take only what was needed while leaving the land as intact as possible. Frank was inside the newly constructed field office reviewing environmental monitoring data with Grace and her team. At 77, he moved slower than he used to, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He'd become the operation's de facto quality control manager, the person who made sure every regulation was followed, every safety protocol observed, every environmental standard exceeded. The workforce of 63 people was mostly local. Native Alaskans from villages within 100 miles, young people trained in geology and environmental science, older workers with construction and heavy equipment experience. The wages were fair, the conditions safe, and the company provided housing and meals for those who traveled from distant communities. Patricia approached Margaret, tablet in hand, her face showing barely contained excitement. "The first gemstone samples are up. Blue sapphires, exceptional quality. Even rough, you can see the clarity. Once cut and polished, these are going to be remarkable." "What are they worth?" Margaret asked. "This first batch, once processed and sold through proper channels, probably $800,000 to $1.2 million. Margaret set down the clipboard she'd been holding. They'd been working on this project for 8 months now. They'd spent hundreds of thousands on surveys, permits, legal fees, and startup costs. And now, finally, they were seeing actual returns. "That's just the beginning," Patricia continued. "Based on what we're pulling up, Samuel's estimates were definitely conservative. Over the next 5 years, if we maintain this careful extraction rate, we're looking at somewhere between $350 and $420 million in total value." The numbers still felt surreal, but Margaret had stopped thinking primarily about the money. What mattered more was what they were building: a model for ethical resource extraction, a partnership that actually benefited local communities, proof that doing things right could also be profitable. The first distribution to the Community Development Fund happened in July, $1.4 million, split among projects proposed by local villages. A new school building in one community, a healthcare clinic in another, internet infrastructure for 3 remote villages, scholarships for Native students pursuing higher education. Margaret attended the fund's board meeting where grants were awarded. She listened to community leaders present their proposals, watched as the board, half appointed by Doyon, half independent community members, debated and decided. When the votes were tallied and the grants announced, several people in the room had tears in their eyes. An elderly Gwich'in woman named Mary approached Margaret after the meeting. "You're doing this right," she said simply. "So many come here and take. You're trying to give back." "We're trying," Margaret replied. "Samuel Whitmore trusted us to honor his wishes. We're doing our best." Mary nodded slowly. He chose well. But not everyone was pleased with their success. In late August, Margaret received a certified letter from David's lawyer. She opened it at the cabin, Frank reading over her shoulder. "Dear Mrs. Hayes," it began, "on behalf of David Hayes, Jessica Matthews, and Thomas Hayes, I am writing to propose a settlement regarding the Alaska property and mineral rights. My clients acknowledge the court's ruling regarding conservatorship. However, they maintain that as children and heirs of the Hayes family, they have legitimate interests in this significant asset. They propose the following: immediate payment of $15 million to be divided equally among the 3 siblings, plus 10% equity in Hayes Geological Resources. In exchange, they will relinquish all future claims to the property and inheritance. This offer is generous and final. Please respond within 30 days. Margaret set the letter down carefully. They want $15 million and 10% of the company for doing absolutely nothing. They think we owe them, Frank said quietly. After everything they did, they still think they're entitled to what we've built. Margaret picked up the phone and called Sarah. "We got a settlement offer from my children's lawyer. We're not accepting it. Please draft a response making that clear." Sarah's reply was swift and unequivocal. Within 2 days, David's lawyer received a letter stating that Margaret and Frank Hayes would not now or ever share ownership of Hayes Geological Resources with their children, that the property was acquired through Samuel Whitmore's independent decision and was not family inheritance subject to division, and that any further legal action would be considered harassment and met with countersuits. 3 days later, Margaret's phone rang. "David. Mom, please, can we just talk, person to person, not through lawyers?" Margaret almost hung up, but something in his voice, desperation maybe, or genuine distress, made her pause. "What do you want, David?" "I want you to understand our position. We're not trying to steal from you. We just think there should be fairness. You and Dad are 74 and 77. At most, you have maybe 10, 15 years left. What happens to all this after you're gone? Shouldn't your children and grandchildren benefit?" "You mean the grandchildren you've kept from us? The ones we haven't seen in over a year because you decided we weren't worth visiting?" "That's not fair, Mom. You left. You went to Alaska and cut us off." "We left after you took our business, put us in a terrible apartment, and tried to have us declared incompetent," Margaret said, her voice cold. "We left after you made it clear we were burdens you wanted to manage rather than parents you wanted to respect. We were trying to help. You were running the hardware store into the ground. You couldn't manage things anymore." "David, that's a lie and you know it. The store was doing fine. You wanted the asset liquidated early. You wanted your inheritance before we were dead." Margaret took a breath. "And now you want this too. You want $15 million for doing nothing except trying to destroy us legally." "Mom, no. Listen to me. Your father and I have built something meaningful here. We're partnering with Native communities. We're extracting resources sustainably. We're funding schools and healthcare and infrastructure. We're proving that resource development doesn't have to be exploitative. We're honoring Samuel's wishes and doing work that actually matters." She paused. "You will never be part of this, David. Not you, not Jessica, not Thomas, unless he proves through years of changed behavior that he's different from you. You taught us what betrayal looks like. You showed us that family isn't about blood. It's about respect and trust. You destroyed both. This is the consequence." "You're going to die someday," David said, his voice turning cold. "And when you do, we'll inherit anyway. Washington state law—" "We've established residency in Alaska," Margaret interrupted, "and we're creating a foundation, the Samuel Whitmore Foundation, endowed with the majority of our assets. When Frank and I die, Hayes Geological Resources will be transferred to a trust managed by the Foundation Board. Our children will inherit a small portion, enough to be comfortable, not enough to change your lives. The rest will continue funding community development in Alaska in perpetuity. Silence on the line. We've already filed the paperwork, Margaret continued. Sarah made sure it's ironclad. You can't break it, you can't contest it, you can't touch it. This is happening whether you like it or not. I can't believe you're doing this, David said, his voice shaking. We're your children. Yes, Margaret said softly, and that makes what you did so much worse. Goodbye, David. She hung up. Her hands were trembling, but she felt no guilt, only a strange sense of liberation. Frank pulled her close. That was hard. It was necessary. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes. I keep hoping they'll understand, that they'll apologize sincerely, that they'll change, but they won't. They still think they're entitled to everything we build just because they're our children. Maybe Thomas will be different, Frank offered. He called last month, remember? Asked how we were doing, didn't mention money. Maybe, Margaret said. But he has to prove it over years, not months. One apologetic phone call doesn't undo what they all did. The Samuel Whitmore Foundation was officially established in September. The board included Margaret and Frank, Patricia, Sarah, Thomas Anaktavuk, 2 Doyon representatives, a professor of geology from the University of Alaska, and a former state environmental official known for his integrity. The Foundation's mission was threefold: support ethical resource development in Alaska, fund education in geology and environmental science, and support communities affected by resource extraction. The initial endowment was $10 million from the first year's extraction proceeds. The plan was to add another $20 to $30 million per year for the next 4 years, creating a permanent fund that could operate indefinitely on investment returns. The cabin, renovated and expanded, became the Foundation's headquarters. Where Samuel had once lived alone with his secrets, now staff worked on grant applications, researchers analyzed environmental data, and community members came to learn about sustainable development practices. Margaret kept Samuel's cellar as a museum of sorts. The original samples remained in their cases, carefully preserved. Samuel's journals were displayed in climate-controlled cases. Visitors, scientists, students, journalists, community members could tour the space and learn about Samuel's 5 decades of work and the corporate suppression he'd faced. A plaque on the cellar wall read, Samuel Whitmore, 1930 to 2021. Geologist, surveyor, truth-keeper. He discovered what others tried to suppress, preserved what others tried to destroy, and trusted that eventually the right people would honor his legacy. This foundation exists because he believed ordinary people could stand up to extraordinary forces. By the end of the first year of extraction operations, the impact on the region was visible and measurable. 63 people had steady employment with good wages. The Community Development Fund had distributed over $4 million to local projects. 3 new students from native villages were enrolled in geology programs at Alaska universities on Foundation scholarships. The healthcare clinic in one remote village had hired a permanent nurse practitioner. A school in another community had new computers and science equipment. But the impact extended beyond Alaska. Margaret and Frank's story had resonated nationally. News outlets continued to cover their progress. Documentary filmmakers produced a feature about their journey from betrayed elderly couple to successful mining operators to foundation builders. Magazine articles profiled them as examples of successful aging, of resistance to ageism, of ethical business practices. Letters arrived at the cabin daily. Many were from elderly people who felt dismissed and powerless, who saw Margaret and Frank as proof that age didn't mean obsolescence. Others were from people fighting their own battles against family members or corporations or societal expectations that tried to diminish them. One letter particularly moved Margaret. It was from a 78-year-old woman in Florida whose adult children had convinced her to sign over power of attorney, then sold her house and moved her into assisted living against her wishes. She'd seen the documentary about Margaret and Frank and had found the courage to hire a lawyer and fight back. She'd won her case, regained her independence, and was now living in a small apartment she'd chosen herself. "You showed me it was possible," the woman wrote. "You proved that being old doesn't mean being powerless. Thank you for fighting. It gave me permission to fight too." Margaret pinned that letter to the wall in her office next to dozens of others like it. In November, a reporter from 60 Minutes came to interview them. Margaret and Frank sat together on the cabin's porch, wrapped in warm coats, the first snow of winter falling softly around them. "Looking back," the reporter asked, "do you regret how things unfolded with your children?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I regret that my children chose greed over relationship. I regret that they valued control over respect. I regret that my grandchildren have been kept from us because their parents can't accept that we refuse to be diminished. But do I regret standing up to them? No. That was the most important thing we've ever done." "Some people would say you owe your children something," the reporter pressed. "After all, you raised them, sacrificed for them. And they repaid that by taking our business, trying to have us declared incompetent, attempting to steal this discovery, and treating us like obstacles rather than people," Frank said quietly. "At some point, the debt of parenthood is paid. We gave them life, education, values, though apparently they didn't absorb those values. We don't owe them unlimited access to everything we build, especially after they tried to destroy us." "What advice would you give to other elderly people facing similar situations?" Margaret looked directly at the camera. "Don't let anyone convince you that your age makes you incompetent. Yes, we're older. Yes, we move slower and forget things sometimes. But we have decades of experience and wisdom that young people don't. We've made mistakes and learned from them. We understand nuance and long-term consequences. Those are advantages, not weaknesses." She paused. "But most importantly, don't let anyone, family or otherwise, take away your autonomy. You have the right to make your own decisions, to control your own assets, to live your life as you choose. If people truly love you, they'll respect those rights. If they don't respect them, then maybe they love control more than they love you. And you deserve better than that." The interview aired in December and was watched by 12 million people. The response was overwhelming. The foundation's website crashed from traffic. Donations poured in from people wanting to support their work. Universities requested Margaret and Frank as guest lecturers. Advocacy groups for elderly rights asked them to testify before Congress about age discrimination. But Thomas called too, not David or Jessica. They had gone completely silent after Margaret's final conversation with David. But Thomas, who left a voicemail that Margaret listened to 3 times before responding. "Mom, Dad, I saw the interview. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about respect and autonomy and how we treated you. I was wrong. We were all wrong, but I was part of it, and I can't undo that. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what we took from you, and I'm sorry. Not sorry because you're successful now, sorry because we hurt you when you deserved respect. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. No expectations, no demands. Just here. I love you both." Margaret called him back a week later. They talked for 2 hours, awkward at first, then more honest. Thomas admitted he'd gone along with David and Jessica because it was easier than standing up to them, because he'd convinced himself their parents really were declining and needed management, because he'd wanted his inheritance early even if he couldn't admit that to himself. "I've been in therapy," Thomas said, "trying to understand why I went along with it. My therapist says I've always had trouble with confrontation, always deferred to David and Jessica. But that's not an excuse. I hurt you both. And I'm sorry." "Sorry isn't enough," Margaret said honestly. "But it's a start. If you're serious about rebuilding relationship, it will take years. It will mean proving through consistent action that you've changed. It will mean accepting that we may never fully trust you again." "I understand," Thomas said. "Whatever it takes." They agreed to regular phone calls, no visits yet, no expectations beyond honest communication. Margaret told Frank about the conversation, and they decided to give Thomas a chance. Cautiously, with clear boundaries, but a chance nonetheless. "He's trying," Frank said. "That's more than the others are doing." Christmas that year was strange and beautiful. Margaret and Frank spent it at the cabin with their chosen family: Patricia, Sarah, Thomas Anaktuvuk, and several relatives from his village, Grace and her teenage daughter, several workers from the extraction operation, and the foundation board members who could make the trip. They cooked a feast together, combining traditional Alaskan foods with familiar holiday dishes. They exchanged small, thoughtful gifts. They told stories and laughed and watched the northern lights dance outside the windows. Margaret thought about past Christmases with David, Jessica, and Thomas, the obligatory visits, the awkward conversations, the sense that everyone was going through motions rather than genuinely connecting. This was different. These people chose to be here because they valued Margaret and Frank, not because of obligation or expectation of inheritance. "This is what family should feel like," Margaret said to Patricia as they cleaned up after dinner. "Respect and choice, not obligation and resentment." Patricia smiled. "You've built something beautiful here. Not just the company or the foundation, the community. People come together around what you're doing because you're doing it right." As the second year of operations progressed, the extraction yields exceeded projections. The community fund grew substantially. More villages received grants. The foundation scholarships expanded to support 30 students. A new training program was established to teach sustainable extraction techniques to young Native Alaskans interested in geology and mining. The economic impact spread beyond direct employment. Local businesses thrived, supplying the operation. A small lodge opened in the nearest town to house visiting researchers and journalists. A restaurant started serving traditional native foods to the workers and visitors. The region, long economically depressed, showed signs of genuine revitalization. But what Margaret treasured most were the stories of individual transformation. Jason, the young native student who'd been inspired by their work, completed his geology degree and came to work for Patricia's consulting firm. A 57-year-old woman who'd been told she was too old to retrain became the operations safety manager after completing mining safety certification. A village elder who'd never imagined his community would benefit from resource extraction now served on the foundation board, ensuring cultural values were protected. In May, on the first anniversary of extraction operations beginning, they held a celebration at the cabin. Over 200 people attended. Workers, community members, partners, supporters. Margaret stood before them all and spoke from the heart. "A year and a half ago, my husband and I were living in a terrible apartment in Portland, convinced our lives were essentially over. We'd lost our business. Our children had betrayed us. We felt powerless and invisible. Then we inherited this cabin from a man who barely knew us but who trusted us anyway." She gestured to the land around them. Samuel Whitmore spent 50 years documenting a discovery that powerful interests tried to suppress. He preserved the truth because he believed that eventually the right people would honor it. He chose us, and I'll never fully understand why, but I'm grateful beyond words. Her voice strengthened. "We've learned something profound here. We've learned that betrayal can become opportunity, that being underestimated can be an advantage, that age brings wisdom and capability, not obsolescence, that family isn't defined by blood but by respect and mutual support, that doing things right, ethically, sustainably, in partnership with communities, can also be profitable, that ordinary people can stand up to extraordinary forces if they're brave enough to try." She looked at Frank, who stood beside her. "We're 75 and 78 now. People still sometimes dismiss us because of our age, but we've built something that will outlast us, a foundation that will continue Samuel's legacy, a model for ethical resource development, and proof that it's never too late to start something meaningful. The crowd applauded, but Margaret raised her hand for quiet. The real heroes here aren't me and Frank. They're Patricia, who verified Samuel's work and guided us through the science; Sarah, who protected us legally and helped us build proper structures; Thomas and Aktuvuk and the Doyen representatives, who partnered with us and brought cultural wisdom we needed; Grace, who showed us how to extract resources while protecting the environment; every worker who does their job carefully and safely; every community member who trusted us enough to let us try this different approach. She paused. We're all part of Samuel's legacy now, and that's something to be proud of. That evening, after the celebration ended and the guests departed, Margaret and Frank sat together on the porch as they had so many nights before. The midnight sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in impossible shades of gold and pink. The forest around them was alive with birdsong and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. "Do you ever regret it?" Frank asked quietly. "The loss of relationship with the kids?" Margaret thought carefully before answering. "I regret that they chose what they chose. I regret that my grandchildren are growing up without us. I regret that David and Jessica will probably never understand what they lost. But do I regret our choices? No. We stood up for ourselves. We refused to be diminished. We built something meaningful. Those were the right choices." "Thomas might come around," Frank offered. "He's been consistent with the calls. He sent that card on your birthday. He's trying." "Maybe," Margaret said. "And if he proves over years that he's genuine, maybe we can rebuild something with him. But it will never be what we thought we'd have with our children. That dream is gone. What we have instead is better in many ways. People who choose to be in our lives because they respect us, not because they're obligated or hoping for inheritance." She leaned against Frank. "We've learned to measure family differently. Not by blood, but by who shows up, who respects our autonomy, who celebrates our victories rather than resenting our success. By that measure, we have a wonderful family." Over the next 2 years, Hayes Geological Resources continued successful operations. The extraction rate remained careful and sustainable, never pushing beyond what environmental assessments recommended safe. The community fund distributed millions more. The foundation expanded its programs, supporting not just students but also research into ethical mining practices and sustainable development models that could be replicated in other regions. Margaret and Frank's health slowly declined in the ways that aging inevitably brings. Frank needed hearing aids and moved more stiffly. Margaret developed arthritis in her hands that made detailed work difficult. They both tired more easily. But their minds remained sharp, and their commitment to the work never wavered. They stepped back from day-to-day operations, hiring younger people to manage the extraction and run the foundation. But they remained on boards, attended important meetings, and served as the moral center of the enterprise, the reminder of why they were doing this and who they were trying to serve. Thomas continued his slow rebuilding of relationship. He visited Alaska twice, awkward visits but genuine ones, where he asked questions and listened more than he talked. His children, Margaret and Frank's grandchildren, came with him on the second visit, teenagers now, curious about their grandparents they barely remembered. Margaret felt a cautious hope that maybe eventually this part of the family could be healed. David and Jessica never reached out. Margaret heard through Thomas that David had filed for divorce, his marriage falling apart under financial stress and disagreements about their failed attempts to access their parents' wealth. Jessica had moved across the country and didn't speak to either of her brothers. The family that had once been so quick to unite against Margaret and Frank had fractured completely. On a September evening, 3 years after they'd first opened the ice cellar and discovered Samuel's life work, Margaret sat in the cabin's main room reviewing grant applications for the foundation. Frank was reading in his chair by the fireplace, the chess set waiting on the table between them for their evening game. The cabin was quiet except for the crackle of fire and the soft turning of pages. Outside, the first colors of autumn were appearing on the birch trees, brilliant gold against the dark green spruce. The air was crisp with the promise of coming winter. Margaret set down the application she'd been reading and looked around the room. The walls held photographs now, of the extraction operation, of community members receiving grants, of students who'd received scholarships, of the foundation board gathered around this very table. Samuel's portrait hung above the fireplace, a photo from his younger years, his weathered face showing quiet determination. "We did it," Margaret said softly. Frank looked up from his book. "What's that?" "We did what Samuel asked. We honored his legacy. We stood up to the people trying to suppress the truth. We built something that will outlast us. We proved we weren't too old to matter." Frank smiled. "We did. And we're still doing it." Margaret walked to the window and looked out at the land that had changed their lives. In the distance, she could see the lights from the extraction operation winding down for the day. Closer, she could see the expanded cabin that now served as foundation headquarters, lights glowing from several office windows where staff worked late on important projects. She thought about the journey that had brought them here, the betrayal by their children that had felt like the end of everything, the inheritance that had seemed like a burden, the discovery that had seemed impossible, the battles they'd fought against corporations and their own family and the forces of ageism that tried to diminish them, the partnerships they'd built with people who became truer family than blood relatives had been. "I used to think getting old meant becoming irrelevant," Margaret said. "That society's message about elderly people being in the way was true. Our children certainly believed it. They treated us like problems to be managed, not people with value and capability." She turned back to Frank. "But we've learned something different. We've learned that age brings perspective and wisdom. We've learned that being underestimated means people don't see you coming until you've already succeeded. We've learned that the final chapters of life can be the most powerful if you're brave enough to write them boldly." Frank stood and joined her at the window. Samuel knew that. That's why he chose us. He understood that people who'd been betrayed and underestimated would fight harder, would care more about doing things right, would understand why this discovery mattered beyond just the money. "Do you think he'd be proud," Margaret asked, "of what we've built?" "I think he's looking down from wherever he is, watching us prove that his 50 years of work weren't wasted, watching communities benefit from resources he discovered, watching the truth he preserved finally being honored. Yes, I think he's proud." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from the autumn sky. Margaret thought about the $73,000 they'd had when they arrived in Alaska, about the apartment with thin walls, about the feeling of being finished and useless. She thought about the $265 million discovery hiding beneath their feet, about the company and foundation they'd built, about the hundreds of people whose lives had been improved by their work. But most of all, she thought about the transformation within herself. She was no longer the woman who had accepted her children's assessment that she was too old and incompetent to manage her own life. She was no longer willing to be pushed aside or diminished. She had discovered power she didn't know she possessed, the power to build something meaningful, to stand against powerful opposition, to prove everyone wrong who'd underestimated her. "I'm glad we came here," she said finally. "I'm glad we were brave enough to ignore our children's advice. I'm glad we opened that cellar door. I'm glad we chose to fight instead of surrender." Frank squeezed her hand. "Me too. Best decision we ever made." That night they played their evening chess game. neither keeping score, just enjoying the familiar dance of pieces across the board. Then they climbed to the loft bedroom Samuel had once occupied, the room they'd made their own, and fell asleep to the absolute silence of the Alaskan wilderness. A silence that felt less like emptiness and more like peace. The next morning brought news that one of their scholarship students had been accepted to graduate school with full funding. A village 200 miles north had requested a grant to build a community center. Patricia called with results from the latest core samples showing the deposit remained robust and well within projected yields. The foundation staff needed Margaret's signature on several documents authorizing new programs. It was all ordinary work of the enterprise they'd built, but to Margaret, it felt extraordinary. Every signature, every decision, every phone call was proof that she mattered, that age hadn't diminished her capacity, that she was still building and contributing and making a difference. At 75 years old, Margaret Hayes was more powerful, more purposeful, and more alive than she'd been at 50. And that transformation, from diminished to powerful, from invisible to celebrated, from betrayed to triumphant, was the real treasure Samuel Whitmore had left them. Not the minerals beneath the ground, not the money those minerals would generate, but the opportunity to prove that it's never too late to start over, to build something meaningful, to stand up to forces that try to keep you down, to refuse the narrative that aging means ending. Margaret and Frank had been told their lives were over. Instead, they'd built a legacy that would continue for generations. They'd been told they were too old to manage their own affairs. Instead, they'd managed a multi-million-dollar operation with skill and integrity. They'd been told they owed their children everything. Instead, they'd chosen to give their wealth to communities that would use it well. In refusing to accept the limitations others tried to impose, they'd become something unexpected. Symbols of resistance, proof that power comes not from youth or physical strength, but from wisdom, determination, and the courage to fight for what matters. The cabin that had hidden Samuel's secret for 50 years now stood as headquarters for an organization that would carry his legacy forward indefinitely. The cellar that had preserved the truth through decades of suppression was now a museum where people learned about standing up to powerful interests. The land that had been dismissed as worthless frozen wilderness was now the foundation of an enterprise that benefited hundreds of people. And two elderly people who had been betrayed and diminished had become advocates, builders, symbols of what's possible when you refuse to accept that your time is over. Anyone can be written off if they're willing to accept that narrative. Society dismisses the elderly, assumes they're past their prime, treats them as problems rather than people with wisdom and capability. But Margaret and Frank Hayes proved something profound, that betrayal can catalyze transformation, that being underestimated can be an advantage, and that the final chapters of life can be the most powerful if you're brave enough to write them on your own terms. As morning light filled the cabin and Margaret sat down at her desk to begin another day of meaningful work, she smiled. Their children had tried to convince them their lives were over. Instead, Margaret and Frank had discovered that their lives were just beginning, and beneath the frozen ground, Samuel Whitmore's carefully preserved samples remained. Not just geological specimens, but proof that truth preserved with patience and faith would eventually find the people brave enough to honor it. The end. Up next, two more powerful stories that will remind you why resilience, courage, and refusing to be dismissed can transform not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you. Click to discover what happens when ordinary people face extraordinary challenges and emerge not just surviving, but thriving. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe it's never too late to rebuild your life on your own terms, to prove wrong everyone who underestimated you, and to build a legacy that actually matters.